then emits a powerful toxin.
For the algae to turn red, it has to be high temperature and high nutrients levels in the water, and that triggers them turning red.
The algae bloom not only emits toxins, but also dissolves the oxygen in the water, leading to massive fish kills, just like the Bible states. In turn, any animals that can flee the toxic river do so. This leads to the second plague, frogs. In Egypt, millions of Nile River frogs leave the water and infest the land. The Bible says, "And the river shall bring forth frogs abundantly, which shall go up and come in thine house." With no food to eat, the frogs quickly died, causing the next two plagues. According to the Bible, there were gnats upon man and upon animals. The gnats are a nuisance, but scientists think they would eventually turn deadly. But with the fourth plague, God says, "I will send swarms of flies upon thee and upon thy servants and upon thy people." But these, our experts say, were no ordinary house flies. They were Lake Timsah or stable flies.
The fly that is common and does occur in swarms and would actually have exploded if there were rotting vegetation or dead fish or toads, and that would have been the stable fly.
Stable flies bite with deep surgical-like pincers and leave an open wound which exposes the body to infection. And then the fifth plague turns deadly. The Bible states, "Upon the horses, upon the asses, upon the camels, upon the oxen, upon the sheep, there shall be a deadly pestilence." The deadly livestock plague was a result of a pathogenic virus spread by the biting gnats of the second plague. The virus is called blue tongue.
It's called blue tongue because their lungs fill up with fluid, they don't get any oxygen, and their tongues turn blue, and they die.
In the sixth plague, the flies spread disease to humans. The Bible states, "Festering boils shall break forth upon man and upon beast." Boils, infected pus-filled skin sores, may have been the result of the deep bites and open wounds from disease-carrying stable flies. We have shown that it is possible that the first 6 plagues were all interconnected, but that was not the end of the terror. The next 4 plagues would raise the stakes, leading to darkness and death.
Coming up next, the premiere of Unwrapping the Shroud, New Evidence. It's all new on Discovery.
In the Bible story of Exodus, God sends 10 plagues upon Egypt. Scientists believe that these plagues could have been interconnected natural disasters, from the river of blood to the plague of boils. But the 7th plague comes out of nowhere. A hailstorm of massive proportions. The Bible calls it the worst storm in the land of Egypt. While unusual in arid northern Africa, hailstorms have been known to hit, leveling the wheat and barley fields of Egypt. The sudden cold and damp conditions in a hot, sultry climate created the ideal environment for a sudden hatch of insect eggs, leading to the 8th plague. Locusts. As they still do today, 3,000 years ago in Egypt, voracious desert locust, or Schistocerca gregaria, ate everything that grows, quickly causing famine and starvation. The 9th plague is terrifying and seems unconnected to the others. The Bible says God sends 3 days of darkness. Is it a sign of God's wrath? a portent of imminent doom, or is there a scientific explanation?
This almost certainly is what's called a Khamsin dust storm. Dust storms in the spring are very common in the Middle East.
Khamsin dust storms bring 90-mile-an-hour winds, throwing up enough sand and dust to block out the sun. They can last a day or two, but this one lasted 3 days, the result of the destruction of crops and ground covering from the locusts. The empty fields and torn-up land could create enough dust and earth to make the sandstorm last 3 terrifying days. And the Egyptians still had to face one more plague. One worse than anything that had ever come before. The 10th plague, as described in the Bible, is the most mystifying. The Bible says, "All the firstborn of the land of Egypt shall die, and all the firstborn beasts." How could this happen? Was it the hand of God or natural phenomena?
To me, the most challenging of all of the 10 plagues to try to explain scientifically is the 10th plague, the selective death of just the Egyptian eldest and the oldest or more dominant of all the animals.
But the death of the firstborn can be scientifically explained. Epidemiologist John Marr has studied the text of the Bible and explored the phenomena of all 10 plagues. Like a homicide detective, Marr has sifted through the evidence and has concluded that the killer was hidden in the food supply. Because the 9 previous plagues had devastated the Egyptian crops.
The fish were dead and could not be consumed. The animals were sickly or dead. The Egyptians were running out of food. And now, here's their spring harvest in the ground and sprouting, being destroyed.
Hail and locusts destroyed an entire year's crop. This forced the Egyptians to take whatever food was left and store it underground. And it could have been this stored grain that led to the 10th plague. To demonstrate, Dr. Marr takes us to the hills of Virginia with a barrel of corn and a traditional moonshine still.
This is a still that's used to make moonshine. And it's an old and honorable tradition to use yeast, which is a fungus, to change corn into alcohol. And here we have corn mash that's fermenting in a controlled environment. It turns to a liquid, and you have good old Virginia moonshine.
Controlled fungus fermentation creates alcohol, but if the fungus is not controlled, it can turn deadly.
Could have been a fungal contamination of the grain stored underground that was contaminated by water and also the droppings of the locusts, and then covered with sand, baking, fermenting, and producing a very, very potent poison called a mycotoxin.
Mycotoxins are microscopic fungi that proliferate rapidly and are acutely toxic.
Various mycotoxins can destroy the immune system, can destroy the blood-forming organs, the liver, the kidney. Even the small amounts can cause illness and death.
3 days of darkness, the 9th plague, could have given mycotoxins enough time to infect only the topmost layers of grain in the underground storage. If ingested or even inhaled, the mycotoxins can kill someone overnight. But this still does not explain how the plague killed only the firstborn child and beast. Marr believes the answer lies in ancient tradition.
In Egypt and other Middle Eastern countries, there is a tradition that the eldest son gets a double portion.
Traditional societies feed the eldest child first in order to protect the future of the family. The same goes for the dominant animals.
And anyone who lives in and around a farm, and the horses come in, or the cows come in, and the pigs come in, which one eats first? The biggest one, the most dominant one. And so if the Egyptians put out grain to feed their animals, it would be the eldest, the strongest animal that would die.
According to this theory, only the top layer of stored grain was infected with mycotoxins. This layer was fed to the firstborn, with the rest of the population eating the grain lower down in the storage containers. Those who ate first died. The rest survived. The Hebrew slaves were housed miles from the Egyptian palaces in an area the Bible calls the land of Goshen. This was the key to their survival of the plagues. Localized disasters, even infected grain stores, would have bypassed the slave shanty towns outside the Egyptian cities. The 10 plagues, from a river of blood to crop failure to deaths in every family, devastated the Egyptians. The Pharaoh gave in to the insistent pleadings of Moses and set his people free. The question is, which way did Moses and the people of Israel go? Our scientific investigation suggests that the biblical stories of Moses and the plagues of Egypt have some basis in scientific fact. If these are real, the rest of the story may be true. If so, we should be able to then follow the route of Moses and find the site of the famous Red Sea crossing, as well as the most sacred site of the Holy Bible, Sinai, the mountain of God, where Moses received the 10 Commandments.
My route has the Israelites coming out of Egypt and then entering the Sinai Peninsula.
Dr. Colin Humphreys and Dr. Peter Williams of Cambridge University have studied hundreds of ancient maps in search of this sacred route.
As we know, the book of Exodus says that the starting point for the Exodus, which is where Pharaoh lived in his palace, that was at a place called Ramesses.
We have already established the biblical city of Ramses, here in the ruins that archaeologists call Cantir. But to uncover the route of Exodus, we must return to the biblical text. God orders Moses to lead his people to the mountain of God, Mount Sinai. But before he can get there, the Bible says the Hebrews are trapped by the Red Sea. The nearest portion of the Red Sea to the city of Pi-Ramses is here near the present-day Suez Canal. Its closeness makes it the traditional site for the biblical miracle in which Moses parts the Red Sea. But our experts say 3,000 years of tradition are wrong.
The really major problem I have with this is that at the time of Ramesses II, in practice, Egypt controlled the whole of the Sinai Peninsula. They'll still be under Egyptian control.
God had told Moses to lead his people to freedom beyond the borders of Egypt. Humphreys believes the route of Exodus must therefore be different, giving us a very different map of the Bible.
So if the Israelites wanted to get out of Egypt, they just get across the Sinai Peninsula as soon as possible. So I think they went across here, and they went straight across to the Gulf of Aqaba.
Instead of crossing the Red Sea 50 miles from the Pharaoh's capital, Humphreys believes Moses and the Hebrews encountered the Red Sea at Aqaba, 300 miles to the east. There is another reason for this conclusion, based on the earlier wanderings of Moses. Moses' goal, his previous home, where he had heard the voice of God. Midian, in what is now Saudi Arabia. But as the Hebrews reached the shoreline, the Bible says